Okay, well, welcome everybody on the call here, our monthly seminar on spirituality, theology, and health. Today, I'm so thrilled to have Sam Thielman as the presenter. He's going to talk about early church fathers and melancholia, ancient strategies for managing despair. So, um, Dr. Thielman is an adjunct associate professor of psychiatry at Duke University. He's currently living in Asheville. From 1999 to 2015, he was a regional psychiatrist for the U.S. Department of State. During the 2000s, he and his family lived in Nairobi, Kenya, where he supported U.S. government employees in East and Central Africa. He has published a number of papers on the psychological effects of the 1998 Nairobi Embassy bombing on Americans and Kenyans. Dr. Thielman has an ongoing interest in the history of the connection between spirituality and mental health. His work on the history of psychiatric therapeutics has appeared in the Journal of the History of Medicine and Allied Sciences and the Bulletin of the History of Medicine. Among his recent publications are The Fraught History of Psychiatry and Christianity, published as the first chapter of Christianity and Psychiatry, and Treating Evangelical Christians, Challenges and Opportunities, that was published in Psychiatric Services in 2024. Dr. Thielman and I have been working together for many, many years, dating back to David Larson.
Sure.
And, he has been a great partner here at Duke, and I just love the man. So I'm going to turn it over to him. He's going to share his screen and begin the presentation.
Okay, let's got it right here. Okay, am I sharing okay here? Can you see that?
Yep, I can see
Okay.
it. It looks good.
Okay, good. Well, the work I'm going to present today is actually something I've been interested in for a long time. And I don't know, I find it very interesting. I hope others do too. It's on the way the early church fathers thought about people who had despair. And my jumping off point is the concept of melancholia, because the ancient concept of depression, or at least one that was related to depression from a medical standpoint, was this melancholia. So here's how I'm going to go today. I'm going to talk about misconceptions about the way Christians in late antiquity dealt with mental disorders. And then I want to talk about melancholia then and now. Then I'm going to mention how Christian writers dealt with melancholia per se. Then I want to talk about their descriptions of despair. And then I want to talk about some practical aspects of the work they did, because there are two big works, one by two serious works by St. John Chrysostom, and then some very interesting insights from Augustine's commentary on the Psalms about how to counsel people with despair. So first, just the misconceptions. In the 20th century histories of psychiatry, often the church during the Middle Ages and late antiquity was presented as mainly demonologically oriented. Those histories often were written from a psychoanalytic perspective, especially the one by Zilborg, and also the Alexander and Selznick history. And so they sort of saw the culmination of the history of psychiatry as the coming of psychoanalysis, and were very oriented toward sort of enlightenment and naturalistic perspective. I would say in the 21st century, things have become very, very different in terms of the view of the way the early church saw both medicine and, to a little bit, psychiatry. Mainly, people don't talk about the history of mental disorders in late antiquity, but there is some writing, especially by classical scholars, on the emotions in antiquity, which is really interesting. So, here is kind of a summary of what I think is the 21st century reevaluation of how we should look at the mentality of the early church fathers. So here's from Gary Fernand's book, Medicine and Healthcare in Early Christianity. And this is in an early chapter. He says, evidence drawn from Christian writers of the first 5 centuries fails to support the pan-demonologic view of early scholars. So some, especially the 20th century scholars thought, the late antiquity people saw everything in terms of demons. Christians typically accepted a natural causality of disease, which was an inheritance from the Greek understanding of illness. Our own perception of disease is as much conditioned by contemporary medical models as the early Christians' perception was by the ordinary medical models of their age, and both reflect the climate of their time. So I think that's a very balanced approach, and I hope to show you more why I think that. So in terms of the term melancholia, of course, I looked it up. I found it at least once in that, as melancholia in DSM-5-TR. Usually it's used as an adjective in terms of melancholic depression, but melancholia as a condition, not sort of detached from the concept of black bile, came into English according to the OED in the 14th century, and so we've kind of been using it that way since. But that's when we started using melancholia to refer to sort of depressive states per se. I think prior to that, melancholia, it included that, but it also included other melancholic diseases. So then that could be the falling sickness and so on. I'll mention those in a minute. So to illustrate the medical view that the early church was dealing with, here's from the Hippocratic writings, The Nature of Man. These constituents are, I hold, I'm talking about the humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. So this is 4 humors notion of the constitution of man. First, I assert that the names of these, according to convention, are separated, and that none of them has the same name as the others, meaning they're separate constituents. Furthermore, that according to nature, their essential forms are separated, phlegm being quite unlike blood, blood being quite unlike bile, and bile being quite unlike phlegm. So the Hippocratic, the 4 humors idea of the constitution of man probably predated the Hippocratic writings, but it really became popular after these writings, and then Galen popularized it further. And then there's this really famous statement from aphorisms that ties melancholia or melancholic diseases to depression. So fear or depression that is prolonged means melancholia, or melancholia is the Greek word. So fear or melancholia that is prolonged means black bile. Okay, but there was another view of another take on the importance of melancholia, and that was of Aristotle, because he saw, so in the Hippocratic view of the 4 humors, you need a balance to be in good health. And if you had the balance, things would be good. But if you had an excess of the various humors, you'd have your, sort of temperament. But Aristotle had this interesting observation that people who were melancholic by temperament had an advantage over people in terms of arts and poetry. So why is it that all those men who've become extraordinary in philosophy, politics, poetry, the arts, are obviously melancholic, and some to such an extent that they're seized by the illnesses that come from black bile, as is said in connection with the stories about Heracles among heroes? Indeed, he seems to have been of this nature, and this is why the ancients named the illnesses of epilepsy sacred disease after him. So I'm not sure what all that refers to, but bottom line is this is sort of encapsulates a larger section, but he saw this melancholic temperament as being important. So here's kind of the number 2 sort of biological connection to the humors. Then there's also epilepsy, and that falling sickness was felt often to be connected to black bile, and so you've got these four things in particular, and there were other conditions, digestive conditions, things that were seasonal in nature that seem to indicate black bile. So that was the view of the ancient world on black bile. So here's just to illustrate that the fathers were not sort of all spiritually minded, and they were not interested in any earthly thing. Here is from Nemesius of Emesa. So Emesa is modern Homs in Syria. It's over near Damascus, and we don't know very much about Nemesius, but we have this serious work that was preserved by him, and it's very oriented toward ancient medical knowledge and philosophy. So here's a relevant section. Every body is a mingling together of the four elements and was evolved from them. Aristotle would have the bodies of living creatures to be made directly of blood alone, since it is immediately by blood that all the members of an animal body are nourished and made to grow. Hippocrates preferred the view that animal bodies are compounded immediately from four humors, so that the more rigid parts are formed of the more earthy and coarse of them, and the soft parts are the more refined. Often all four humors are found in the blood, as may be seen during phlebotomy. So then here's another thing that refers specifically to the emotions in Nemesius. There are 6 different manifestations of fear: diffidence, shyness, shame, consternation, terror, and anguish. Fear starts with a chilling of the extremities, all the hot blood running to the heart as to the center of control, just as a mob, when frightened, rushes to the rulers of the city. The organ of such grief is the pit of the stomach. So Galen, in his work on Demonstration, Book 3, says something to this effect: people attacked by fear experience no slight flow of yellow bile into the stomach. So this is the bishop of this city, and he's getting into serious details on the medical aspects of fear. This isn't exactly in chronological order, but I just wanted to demonstrate these fathers' rootedness in sort of medical thinking. So here's Origen talking about delirium. This is in his conversation with Celsus. Is a debate over sort of an apologetic debate, and he's talking about the witnesses to the resurrection, and he says they probably were not under a delirium or melancholia, okay, because they were kind of in their senses. So it's not irrational to believe that a dream may take place while one is asleep, but to suppose a waking vision in the case of those who are not altogether out of their senses and under the influence of delirium or melancholia is incredible. So again, just his rootedness in these theories of his day. So well, I'll do one more of these just because I think they're quite interesting. Here's from Gregory of Nyssa. Physicians declare that our intellect is also weakened by the membranes that underlie the sides being affected by disease, and they call the disease caused by this weakening frenzy, since the name given to these membranes is phrenes in Greek. So again, just this rootedness in biology. This is from Lactantius, another apologist from the 3rd and 4th century. The mind may be distinguished while the soul is uninjured, which is accustomed to happen in the case of the insane. So that, in other words, the soul is separate from the mind, and you could be sort of crazy, but your soul would be intact. So they're thinking in very biological ways about stuff, which is not to say it was exclusively biological. It wasn't. So in the New Testament, I think there's sort of a reflection of what these later writers are running with in at least a couple of accounts in the Gospels of diseases. So I'm going to focus on the one in Matthew 24, 424. So here's the NRSV. So it says, so his fame, talking about Jesus, so his fame spread throughout all Syria. And they brought to him all the sick, those who were afflicted with various diseases and pains, demoniacs, epileptics, and paralytics, and he cured them. But in the King James, it reflects, I think, a little bit better the underlying Greek here, because it says, people were taking him with divers diseases and torments, and those which were possessed with devils, and those which were lunatic, and those which had palsy, and he healed them. So the ones possessed with devils are the demonized in the Greek, and the people that Jesus healed that are described as epileptics in the NRSV are actually the moonstruck. Okay, so moonstruck might be epilepsy, it might be madness. I mean, it is ambiguous, which it was, but I'm trying to point out that there, even in the New Testament, in the Gospels, there's the possibility of a distinction between demon possession and people who were under the influence of the moon, or who were moonstruck. And so there were these potential multiple etiologies for mental illness. Then the second thing about the Christian, so the early Christian concept of melancholia, I think included the possibility of both supernatural and medical elements, but it also had this philosophical element. So I want to also point out that Christians, to an extent not characteristic of many of their contemporaries, adopted a mentality of self-examination, self-reproach. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but I think that created this state that Robert Burton later called religious melancholy in the Anatomy of Melancholy. So in ancient Christian thinking, Hippocratic medicine was congenial because it had this naturalistic approach. Now, there were people who actually also rejected Hippocratic medicine for that reason, but they were not the more orthodox of the bishops. Most of the people who were orthodox, who were writing, were open to Hippocratic medicine because it had this natural component. And also the other thing is, they really did not like the pagan approach to healing disease. So, and one thing they spoke out against quite a bit was Asclepian cults, or the use of various forms of magic for healing, particularly in mental illness. So this is an Asclepian temple from Greece. So those of us who've been in Greece seen these. But anyway, here's from Tatian. So Tatian's quite early. This is 2nd century, and he spoke out against the use of magical methods for treating madness in this particular speech. I think it's kind of interesting that he would even do that. So a disease is not killed by antipathy, like opposites, nor is a madman cured by wearing amulets. These cures result from visitations of demons. So that was the agency of the cure. How can it be right to ascribe help given to madmen to matter and not to God? The skill of those who use such means to cure is to turn men away from God's service and to contrive that they should rely on herbs and roots. So sometimes when people have quoted Tatian at this point, they're saying that he's opposing the use of medicines, and he might be, but I think he's particularly opposing the use of herbs and roots in a magical setting. So he was also not particularly influential on doctrine in the history of the church. He's sort of considered a slight heretic for reasons I'm not clear about, but anyway, that's the case. Now let's go on to these descriptions of despair, because I want to illustrate that the fathers were quite aware of people who had these deep emotional distresses. So here is from St. John Chrysostom in his letters to Olympias, a very interesting woman I'll talk about a little bit more. For despondency is for souls a grievous torture chamber. So the word he's using here is not melancholia, it's athumia. So that's athumia in the medical theory could be related to melancholia, but it didn't have to be, but that could be an explanation for it. So, but he's not focusing on the medical part. He's focusing on what people are going through. For despondency is for souls a grievous torture chamber, unspeakably painful, more fierce and bitter than every ferocity and torment. It imitates the poisonous worm that attacks not only the body, but also the soul, and not only the bones, but the mind. It is a continual executioner that not only tears into pieces one's torso, but also mutilates the strength of one's soul. It is a continuous night, darkness with no light, a tempest, a gale, an unseen fever burning more powerfully than any flame, a war having no relief, a disease which casts a shadow over nearly everything visible. For even the sun and the air seem to be oppressive to those who are suffering from these things, and midday seems to be as dark as night. So I thought that was really, I mean, he wasn't called John Chrysostom for nothing. You know, the golden mouth, he is very eloquent, and I think he really is in that particular passage. But he's not the only one. Here's from John Cassian, who was a father, church father, who was a monastic father. So he's dealing mainly with issues of monks. So sometimes without any apparent reason, we are by the instigation of our crafty enemies suddenly depressed with so great a gloom that we cannot receive with ordinary civility the visits of those who are near and dear to us. And whatever subject of conversation is started by them, we regard it as ill-timed and out of place. So there's a lot of irritability, and we can give them no civil answer, as the gall of bitterness is in possession of every corner of our heart. So here he's alluding to these potential medical, kind of origins this of this irritability. And then here's a suggestion that temperament might be responsible. This is from Gregory the Great, so this is a little bit later in the 6th century. Some are not made joyful or sad by circumstances, but are so by temperament. So again, just illustrating, the people who were thinking about this and writing about this had a very subtle understanding a lot of times of what could be going on. But it wasn't all about medicine. It wasn't all about temperament. So that they were very interested in how sin could relate to depression. So here's John Cassian saying dejection can result from anger or greed. Sometimes the spirit of dejection is found to result from the fault of previous anger, or to spring from the desire of some gain which has not been realized. So, and in fact, this is all part of this concept of acedia. So, depending on who's interested and how knowledgeable they are, I mean, you can hardly talk about melancholia or sadness in the ancient world without thinking about acedia, which I think, if you think about it hard, isn't the same, but it's worth discussing just as a kind of a side note, because it is of interest to a lot of people who are interested in spirituality and mental health. So here's an original definition of acedia from Evagrius Ponticus, who was one of the early guys to write about it in his book, 8 Thoughts. So acedia is a relaxation of the soul, and a relaxation of the soul which is not in accord with nature does not resist temptation nobly. For what is food for the healthy body constitutes a temptation for the noble soul. So acedia is not attending to your spiritual health. So if you see where it is on this list of 8 bad thoughts. So this is the predecessor of the 7 deadly sins. And so it kind of goes from less serious to more serious. So pride is the most serious, and gluttony is serious, but it's the least. So, and they were thought to maybe progress to each other. So you can see the sadness and acedia are kind of paired there together in the eight evil thoughts. Later, they became sloth, and so that was at a later time. But that's where acedia fits in this list. So the acedia was a kind of a sinful origin of depression. It was a lack of interest in the welfare of your soul. So here's how Evagrius suggested that you should counter acedia. The spirit of acedia drives the monk out of his cell, but the monk who possesses perseverance will ever cultivate stillness. So he advocated this, and he wasn't the only one, the notion of attending to the stillness in your soul to counter acedia, and also the perseverance. So just continuing. Perseverance is the cure for acedia, along with the execution of all tasks with great attention and the fear of God. So it was not only just kind of mental perseverance, but it was also attention to good works. Set a measure for yourself in every work that you do. Do not let up until you have completed it. Pray with understanding and intensity, and the spirit of acedia will flee from you. So, like, set some goals, set some things to measure yourself by. I thought these were kind of very practical things that they were thinking of back then. And it wasn't just sin. We said they weren't predominated with this idea of demons, but like the idea of spiritual forces was definitely part of the calculation. But they don't seem to have been as overwhelmed by this as at least I would have thought initially. So anyway, if the demon gets an opportunity, he suggests thoughts to men's hearts, and men believe the suggestions of the demon. So this is from Recognitions of Clement. So this is like a I think it's a pseudepigraphical, right? It's not really written by Clement of Rome, but it reflects the mindset of the era. So if the demon gets an opportunity, he suggests thought to men's hearts, and men believe the suggestions of the demons as if they were the perception of their own souls. The demons excuse the passionateness of others by excess of gall. They color over the madness of others by the vehemence of melancholy, and even extenuate the folly of some as the result of abundance of phlegm. Okay, so he's kind of he's showing how they saw there was not an either or, but a both and aspect to the activity of demons, and then the constitution of the body, because he's referring right here to some of the humors, okay, and how the demons are at kind of at work in this. So I'm shifting now to this final part, which is the practical approach to Christians dealing with despair. So I am going to focus on two particular things. One is this writings of Chrysostom to Olympia, and then to Stagirius also. But anyway, so this is where the idea of the so-called philosophical therapy of the ancient world comes in, because if you want to think about the context of these Christian writers, I think it was probably the Roman philosophers, maybe to an extent, some of the Greek writers, but I think in particular of Seneca, his letters, which were written around the time of Paul, and Cicero, Tusculan disputations. Both of these are considered to be, this genre of writing by Martha Nussbaum in her book Therapy of Desire, which is really influential. And she also says the Epicureans, I'm not as familiar with in terms of their actual writings, but were very kind of strong on philosophy as a cure for the soul. Okay, well, so that I think the Christian writers, when they're writing their consolations to particular people, they were doing so very much with this in mind. I think there's some suggestion, that for the philosophers or the writers like Seneca and Cicero, there was maybe a little bit of a rhetorical flourish, as well as maybe not quite so practical, or they're not necessarily writing to somebody with the same type of earnestness as perhaps John Chrysostom was. But we're real clear that John Chrysostom wrote these letters to Olympia with this earnestness, because they were both really under a lot of stress when he wrote this. So he was the Bishop of Constantinople. So anyone who's been to Hagia Sophia, in Istanbul, that was his church, and it was in a post-Constantine era but he got really on the bad side of the ruler who had built the empress who built a giant silver statue of herself in front of the church that he did not like and preached against, and it made her so mad that she expelled him like in a big way from Constantinople, and he was on his own, and he was like traveling, he was exiled, and he writes about his stresses in the letters to Saint Olympia, just as a side note, sort of trying to relate to her, saying, "Yeah, I know you got it bad, me too," and he talks about this, but. Anyway, this Olympia was a wonderful person. She had been she had married a very, very wealthy man. I think she herself was wealthy, so she was from a super wealthy family in Constantinople, and when she became a Christian, she was giving it all away, and people were like telling her, don't do that, and she really wanted to. She really wanted to live a godly life, and she just loved John Chrysostom, so she devoted herself to his care, and it's told in this J.N.D. Kelly biography of John Chrysostom, was quite interesting. So anyway, when he left, it just crushed her because she loved him. So she was in her 30s, he was in his late 50s. There's absolutely no suggestion of anything improper going on, but she was so devoted to him spiritually, and she got really dejected by the state of her section of the church in Constantinople, at that time, and the situation that they were all in. So anyway, he said so there's 17 of these letters. They were translated first into English in their entirety only in 2016. So there've been portions of them that were translated earlier, and they've been in modern languages, but just not English, but they're really accessible right now. So one thing he told her, which I think is interesting, is pay great attention to the restoration of your bodily health. For dejection causes sickness. Employ various skilled physicians and take medicine. So I think, for all our patients who are resisting medications for religious reasons, it's just interesting to hear this great guy talking about this. But it's not just like a license to take medicines. It's more about take care of your physical health, attend to this. But he thought there was more to it. So attend to your physical health to correct despondency. You lately affirmed, he said, that it was nothing but despondency which caused this sickness of yours. I shall not believe it until you've rid yourself of your despondency, until you got rid of your bodily infirmity. So she was writing to him about this kind of their bodily infirmity, but he's also saying, take care of your emotions. These are related, and so on. But then despondency here is the Greek word athumia. So. And this was a thing for them. It wasn't just kind of casually used. So and then again, I'm selecting some things I thought were interesting to us, but there's a lot in these letters. So maintain a calm state of mind. After having succeeded in self-control, you're now succeeding in apatheia. So this isn't apathy. This is like a sense of emotional control. Okay. For the desire for luxury does not trouble you, and you do not have to work to control it. But having once and for all suppressed this desire, and having rendered your flesh impervious to it, you have taught your stomach to be content with only as much food and drink as you need not to die, and not to suffer bodily affliction. This is why I do not call your fasting and your self-control by these terms, but something else greater. So he thought this was a really desirable thing in her state of struggling with the athumia, and he's trying to encourage her, and these letters are very encouraging. So he also was very insistent on controlling the so-called grievous thoughts or the wicked thoughts, and the Greek term for this, and this is a term that they're using, it seems intentionally. It's not just John Chrysostom who uses it, logismoi. So make it your business to shake off the despondency of your soul. You surround yourself with grievous thoughts, all these things that are making you sad or just dwelling on them. So even inventing things which do not exist, as you have said, lacerating yourself in vain for no purpose whatsoever with great harm to yourself. So this is just a representative quote of this strategy of countering the grievous thoughts, okay, which was also something that Evagrius Ponticus advised. So then he kind of encourages hope for her. Rejoice, therefore, and exult and revel in your virtues, and by no means give up hope that we will see each other again. And we may remind you of this through words. Now, the truth is they didn't actually see each other again. He died. This is one of the last, maybe the last thing he wrote. He died in 407. but yeah, but anyway, I thought the interesting thing is the context of this, he's telling her all these great things she's done. And then he's encouraging her to kind of remember these things. You've kind of developed yourself in your spiritual life and your Christian life, and reflect on this and be encouraged by them. So that was one of his strategies. And then there's this. It's like it's a specific pray for a spiritual intervention. So as I consider the pilot governing everything, who prevails over storms, who calms the raging gale, not through skill and artfulness, but with a single nod. It is not at their beginning, not immediately when they first arise, that he customarily obliterates evil, but when they increase and when they come to their furthest point. He does wondrous things beyond all expectation, demonstrating his own power and training the patience of those who have fallen. Okay, and then he encourages her, beseech God, whom you serve, simply to give a nod. So he's saying, you should pray for divine intervention. So I thought that was also quite interesting. So it's not just a matter of philosophy, and it's not a matter of just kind of making sure your body's okay. He has a specific, kind of take on the possibility of a divine intervention. There's a similar and even lengthier, but my quotes won't be lengthier, set of writings from, there's similar set of writings on to this monk Stagirius, okay? This was written quite a bit earlier than the Olympia correspondence, or it's not really correspondence, but his letters to Olympia. And so Stagirius is interesting. He was another rich person from a very wealthy family who'd taken on monasticism, but I think Olympia hadn't really taken on monasticism. She was kind of a dedicated person, but Stagirius was actually a monk, and so he'd had a lot of traumas, which John Chrysostom outlines in the beginning of the book, and then he had developed what they were calling the falling cities, and he would apparently writhe, and he had a lot of kind of uncontrolled whatever, maybe it was epilepsy, we just don't know. Stagirius himself thought it was a demon, okay? And it's interesting how Chrysostom dealt with this, because he didn't deny it might be demonic, but that wasn't his main concern. He said, don't get over focused on the demonic element of this, focus on the spiritual element. So he wasn't really interested in the diagnosis of medically at all. He was interested in the spiritual component. And he gave him a lot there. This is a very lengthy correspondence. Again, for our sort of interest, I mean, this has very recently been published. The English translation of it has been published, and not a lot of this wasn't even in a modern language until fairly recently. But anyway, it's very interesting. So here's just a sampling of this, and this is going to be the last slide on Chrysostom. But so this has to do with depression and the supernatural. So I will undertake to apply your consolation with words. So this is at the very beginning of it. So this is his quote therapy. So this whole series of things is intended strategically as a therapy. And I don't think it's anachronistic to say that, like that he intended this to be helpful to John Chrysostom. I mean, to Stagirius. So then he says, there seems to be one cause for your despondency, the badness of this evil demon. You said that you suffered so excessively in various ways that the power of your soul was encompassed with despondency, so much that you were often compelled almost to come upon the news. Sorry, I dictated this. That should be noose, Noose, upon the river and upon the precipice, i.e., he's suicidal. Okay. And then he said shortly thereafter, you do not see clearly whether there will be a release and relief of the sickness because you have often expected this and you've fallen back into the same things again. So this is just this kind of persistent, repetitive thing. And then he says, many of those things that seem to be great terrors appear unbearable before they are scrutinized well. But if someone should examine these things with reasoning, he will find that they are much less significant than expected. Okay, so he's advocating a kind of reasoned approach to what on the surface seemed to be the effects of a demon. And if you read this through, it's very interesting. It's kind of ameliorating response to an overly kind of demon oriented approach to his despondency. So just to summarize, this is back to Olympia. Endure athumia. This is what he was advising. Endure athumia, cultivate apathia, counter this logismoi, the wicked thoughts or the grievous thoughts. Live according to your philosophia, which I didn't really mention, but this is another thing, the Christian philosophy. And he thought you should really focus on that specifically and attend to your physical health. Okay, and then finally, I wanted to just mention this because it was so great from St. Augustine, and this is from his commentary on the Psalms. So this is a very different piece of literature than these letters of John Chrysostom. So this is his iterations on the Psalms, which has recently been translated by New City Press into a really readable translation. It's kind of a combination of commentary and then some of his sermons, and the sermons in particular really, kind of intriguing because he was a rhetorician, and he was probably, maybe you could argue, he's the greatest rhetorician of all time. I mean, he's very interesting. So anyway, he's talking about Psalm 94. So when he talks about it, if you actually. So it's Psalm 93 in the Septuagint, which he was using, but in our Bibles, it's the Psalm 94. So you would think he's, so in the Psalm, it's like, it starts with like, God, everything's going wrong. And then he's cursing all these people who are going wrong. And then the Psalm moves to this thing is don't you know who made this? Don't you know who did all this? And so it kind of moves on to this more encouraging thing, and it moves on from there. So it's complicated and very interesting song, but it starts with this kind of like, what are you doing, God, kind of tone. So then here's Augustine's commentary on this. The psalm grieves with you and asks questions with you, but not because it does not know. Because in Augustine's way of praying the Psalms, you're supposed to use the Psalms as your own words. Okay, so this is God's words given to you in Augustine's view. The Psalm agrees with you and asks questions with you, but not because it does not know. Rather, does it ask you the question which it knows the answer, so that in it you may find that which you did not know. Anyone who wants to console someone else acts like this. Unless he grieves with the other, he cannot lift him up. First of all, he grieves with him, and then he strengthens him with a consoling word. So I think this gives us insight into what both Chrysostom and Augustine presumably would have done, but he's of the same era as Chrysostom. So too the psalm, and indeed the Spirit of God, though knowing everything, asks questions with you, as though giving expression to your own words. So just to conclude, so I think, obviously there's a vast span between us and the church fathers, but I do think for those of us who are interested in the relationship between spirituality and mental health, there are a lot of things to learn from, because they were very knowledgeable about, many of them were very knowledgeable about the medical theories and knowledge of their day. They were very knowledgeable in philosophy, and they were deeply spiritual people. So I think they had this integration of contemporary medical and philosophical approaches with their overall spiritual perspective. It looks like, at least from these letters to Chrysostom, and I presume he would be representative of others, had a practical and empathetic focus. And their areas of concentration would be on hope, endurance, rational thinking, and a correct philosophy of life. So I'll stop there, and if you want to discuss or have questions, we can do that.
Terrific, terrific, Sam. What an incredible survey of the early fathers and their views on melancholia. So we have on the call here Warren Kinghorn here at Duke, John Petit at Harvard, and Kenneth Decleva. So
Yeah, Ken DeClave is one of my colleagues from the State Department. He's at UT in Texas.
awesome. Warren, I see you're unmuted.
Yeah, thanks. Sam, it's good to see you again. Thanks for this lecture. I really appreciate it.
Thanks,
I have a couple of questions. One has to do with Asclepius. I think you said that the early Christians tended to dismiss the Asclepian cult or to be against it, but I remember that Ferngren in his book, tends to argue that there was at least some sense of resonance between Asclepian healing and Christian healing, and that some of the early Christians would call Christ the new Asclepius. And I wondered if you could comment more on that, and then maybe related to that, or maybe different. I wonder in your readings if you encountered ways that the church fathers talked about the demons that might challenge some of the ways that we think about demons in our time. I know that there's a psychologist named Joanna Collicutt in the UK who wrote an essay recently where she argued that in the New Testament that the demons were omnipresent, but they also maybe were not as big of a deal as we tend to think about now, that in some ways they were just kind of things that afflicted people. Like you would have a demon, like we might say you have a cold in some ways. And I wondered, in terms of your reading, in terms of what you've encountered, like how would these early Christian accounts challenge or maybe affirm our kind of modern understanding of
well,
the
what you
demons?
just said, I think is very consistent with what I was reading, especially in in John Chrysostom, the consolation to Stigerius. I think that's very consistent with the notion, the demon as a cold or whatever, like it's not, it's kind of part of it's part of the world. It's the way it's made. And also, as you, I'm sure well know, like in ancient philosophy, there were the daimons, or Daemons, who were both good and bad. They're not just uniquely evil, and I think for the Christians, they were evil, but that was a change within the Christian faith. But yeah, given that was the case, you could see why it might not be as, they might downplay it compared to the way we think about it today, if that's what you're suggesting.
Yeah, just that, like, it makes a little more sense to think about natural and demonic causation as being a both and. If, as you say, the demons are part of the natural world, like they're mostly understood as immaterial creatures, but they're still creatures that afflict, and so there's a way in which it's not like this absolute kind of supernatural natural binary that we tend to apply nowadays. At least that's what it seems like. That's kind of my question. Is that consistent with your understanding?
And also in what you said about Gary Ferg, I hadn't really focused on that chapter in his book about Asclepius, but that makes perfect sense. That they would basically consider Christ as a physician, because if you look at in the reading, if you look at the philosophers, like the Greek philosophers, they're often using physicians as a model for the way philosophy should work. Like we're physicians for the soul, and so and Augustine's frequently talking about Christ as a physician. And in fact, there's a I couldn't dig it up for this talk, but there's a quote from him about Christ being like the physician who comes to the madman, who even though they're resisting him, he he comes to cure you anyway, like he's like, he wants to help you. So I think that physicians in general are viewed positively. So, but I'll good suggestion for further digging for me.
Yeah, thank you.
Good. Kenneth, you're up.
Yeah, hi, I'm Ken DeClava. For those who don't know me, I know Sam for about 20 years. We worked together overseas, and I'm a practicing psychiatrist and a professor at UT Southwestern Medical Center and a practicing Catholic. I have a couple of comments and then some questions for Sam, and thank you for this wonderful talk. Um, One comment is I sort of found myself free associating and remembering a talk from a teacher of mine who also taught at Duke for a long time. Some of you may remember him, named Jeff Andreessen, who was a psychoanalyst. But he wrote a beautiful paper about 30 years ago, a psychoanalytic paper called Biblical Job Changing the Helper's Mind, where he talks about a lot of what Sam talked about, how early church fathers and writers in the Bible saw human suffering. And the story of Job that he talks about is one of deprivation, unknowing, and transformed awareness. And then he talks about how a properly run psychotherapy, in a sense, does that. And he talks about despair. All of us on this call know that when Job's friends came to him, they wept. So part of that is the emotion. But the other thing is the value of what Sam has talked about. And I was going to ask you, Sam, how do we connect this with today's world, where in our practices we see skyrocketing rates, especially among young people, of depression, anxiety, and an epidemic of loneliness? So I'm that's my last question is, what do you think about that? And what have the early church fathers in your research written about loneliness?
Um, well, they would have written about it in the context of of the monks, in their cells. I mean, because I think that was one of the things that people with the acedia, may have dealt with. But I don't think that would probably, I think strictly speaking, I'm not sure how they were dealing with somebody very, people in a very different setting than we are. And in fact, St. Chrysostom says, okay, was for Sagirius, if you, and of course, they're not in a therapy setting either. They're like clergy, dealing with, their people are coming to them. But he was saying if you were in a different setting, I would be explaining the gospel to you first, and then I would be talking about these other, but I can jump forward because I have this other stuff. So I think so. I don't think that's our role, in our jobs as the mental health people per se. But I think, I think they would have wanted to engender hope. I think they're in the people they were dealing with. That would probably be the main, lesson for the. Well, actually, for the clinical work, there's several things that they're, having a right view of life, countering the bad thoughts, persisting, not giving up, I think all those things generally with, kind of are similar.
John, I see
Yeah,
you're unmuted. Go ahead.
yeah, thank you, Sam. That was great.
Thanks.
Just building on that last point, I wonder if you have thoughts about the relationship between this correct philosophy of life and our current ways of thinking about CBT and spiritually integrated psychotherapy.
I mean, I guess I don't know. What are you thinking? I mean, it seems like the answer is in the question, maybe, but yeah, it's uh,
Yeah,
yeah.
it sounds like we're recognizing the importance of thinking correctly in
Yeah.
treatment of depression, and for believers, there's a deeper dimension to that. I just wonder if the church fathers are pointing us there um, already, and maybe we're just catching up with them.
Well, and the other thing that struck me is these writings are deeply, deeply spiritual, and they're writing to people who are very serious about their Christian commitment. So, and especially both of the people he's writing to seem to be very depressed and sometimes hopeless. So his stance is one of encouragement. With Olympia, he also kind of goads her a little bit. It's like, well, don't write to me again if it's just going to be the same thing over and over. He basically says something along these lines. And yet he's very encouraging too. And she knows he loves her because they had this long relationship. So I think he's talking in that context. So, but I think, that they were people who took their spiritual life super seriously. And so I think the writings have to be, these writings have to be understood with that in mind. To me, what was interesting as a psychiatrist is just their attention to the possibility, of a medical element to what was going on, and that idea is not, in any sense foreign to Christian thinking, at least from that era. I don't know how. I don't think it was later on too, because I think physicians, even in the Middle Ages, they were doing what they did. So.
Yeah, that idea of grieving with too sounds very
Yeah, the Augustine quote I thought was just so very, very interesting, and also his idea that that's also the stance of God toward us. I mean, God understands us, and he's going to work with us as human beings.
Warren, I see you're unmuted. Go ahead.
No, I just never muted myself again after my question. So yeah, I'm good. Thank you.
It was an oversight.
Thanks,
I have one other comment to make, and Sam, maybe you could comment. I don't know if you supervise residents in their training, psychiatry residents or psychology graduate students. One of the things I've found with a lot of our residents is a lot of them don't have, I hate to say this, it's not politically correct, but they don't have faith. They wouldn't acknowledge a faith. A lot of them are atheistic or at best secular. So they don't know how to talk uh, with patients about their faith and how, in many instances, patients' faith can be a source of hope for them. They can't understand on a felt level if you ask a patient who's suffering, like Sam sees a lot of medically ill psychiatric patients, as do I. These are people with horrible medical illnesses, neurologic illnesses like MS, they've had strokes, myasthenia, chronic pain, chronic regional pain syndromes, cancer pain. The burden of suffering is so unbelievably great, and they can't have a conversation with them about the patient's faith. It's a checkbox on the EMR, but there's never a conversation. How do you handle that, Sam? I find it easy with the patients. I find it very difficult with the residents.
Yeah, well, thankfully, I'm not in a position to supervise residents right now, so I don't have the issue. But maybe it's not thankfully. Maybe I should wish I did, so I could be more used to people. But yeah, I think this is one thing that came up a couple of years ago at the APA meeting when we were talking about, sort of dealing with evangelicals, how few people who are treaters really understand at all, like, what people who have religious convictions may be thinking or talking. It's actually a barrier to care. If you're just clueless, or you think, based on some disillusioned, kind of experience from the past, what they're thinking, and then you sort of try to relate to them using that, you can get off base. So I think that's a big case for, proper training, for the trainees, just in terms of spiritual, interviewing, and, how to do that and how to be sensitive. So.
For sure. Okay, we only have one more minute. If there are any other points, Kenneth, go ahead, unmute yourself.
I just want to say thank you. I'll sign off. Appreciate y'all, especially
Okay,
Sam.
thanks, Ken.
Good seeing you. Great talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you truly, Sam. This is, your wealth of wisdom in terms of the history is just remarkable. And we all appreciate you and your knowledge. And thank you all, too, for the conversation that we had here today. So,
All right. Thanks, Harold.
okay.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Sam.
Bye-bye,
Thanks, Harold.
everybody.
Good to see you,
Bye.
John.